Worldwide, there is an apparent rise in strongmen and authoritarian leaders, and there is no dearth of leaders who encourage personality cults. What issues arise, however, when leaders seek devotees rather than support from citizens? There may be nothing wrong with leaders enjoying a mass following. The danger is when leaders are consumed by and trapped in the image and the mythologies that they engineer for themselves and start to make unwise, destructive decisions that impact their nations, their economies, and the world. The risks increase the longer an authoritarian leader remains in power and the greater their corrosive influence on institutions, the media, and electoral systems. Does reliance on cult-like personalities over reality always end in disaster? And what motivates people to revere cult leaders? Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you enjoy the material we create, then please do like and subscribe to help other people find our fantastic speakers. And do please also consider becoming a patron. Steve Hassan is a world-renowned expert on cults, undue influence, and authoritarian control. He is the creator of the Bite model and influence continuum. Stephen specializes in recovery and strategic intervention for those people within cults. He is also a TEDx speaker, the author of 4 books, as well as being a mental health professional and researcher. I hope those details are correct.
Yes, thank you.
And we will put links to the books in the description of the video. But I think, first of all, I'd love to welcome you to the channel.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're going to talk about a wide range of topics, but we are also, of course, going to focus on political cultism and perhaps relate that back to religious cults. So let's start there. How would you define a cult? And is there a clear distinction between religious and political cult leaders?
Good question. So I guess I want to just do a quick intro and say that I got interested in this weird topic because I was recruited into a front group of the Moonies cult, a religious political cult, back in 1974, in February of 74. In fact, the same month Patty Hearst was abducted by the Symbionese Liberation Army and made into a terrorist. I was promoted into the cult. I learned how to recruit and indoctrinate people. I was in leadership meetings with Moon as he said democracy was satanic. We had to infiltrate the US government, that we wanted to destroy the separation of church and state. And if it wasn't for a near-fatal van crash due to sleep deprivation, and 2 weeks in the hospital, which led to a visit to my sister, which led to a deprogramming, which led to me realizing, holy mackerel, Chinese communist brainwashing techniques were used on me to make me a Moonie. And my realizing I can't be part of this group. I don't believe any of these things. And I grew up Jewish. I should say 1.3 miles from Donald Trump in Flushing, Queens, New York, educated about the Holocaust, but I had been indoctrinated to believe the Holocaust was necessary because the Jews didn't accept Jesus. And of course, Moon claimed to be greater than Jesus and fulfilling his mission. So here I am with you, Jonathan, 47 years later. And as you said, I became a mental health professional. I've been researching. I just became fascinated at the mind and how people can be recruited and indoctrinated and how to help people exit. And so to answer your question now, I think of a influence on a continuum from ethical to unethical. Ethical influence includes informed consent, whereas unethical influence involves lying, either outright lying or withholding vital information or distorting it. And there's a whole list of criteria that I refer to as the BITE model of authoritarian control. The B stands for behavior control, the I is information control, then thought control and emotional control. And your listeners can go to freedomofmind.com and you can see the whole influence continuum and its characteristics and values, and the whole list of potential behavior control variables, like controlling sleep, for example, controlling clothing, or controlling language, requiring rigid rules and regulations, dependence and obedience. So to answer your question, I think of cults on this continuum where there are ethical cults or productive groups where people are fervent and passionate, but they're thinking for the members are thinking for themselves. They're allowed to read outside literature, critical literature. They're allowed to talk to whoever they want to talk to. They're allowed to leave without threats or fears or harassment. And the more BITE variables, we get to what I referred to as a dissociative disorder. And to explain it, I like to describe the old Steve Hassan and the Mooney Steve Hassan. The real me was still there, but I was completely programmed. One example I like to use is a computer getting hacked by malware, where it takes over your operating system. It was like the Mooney identity took over me, and the accident and the deprogramming helped me to get out. And then I had to deal with, how do I deprogram myself? How do I get all of these ideas and beliefs and experiences and phobias out of my mind? So having said that, I will tell you the way I think about influence. It can happen in a one-on-one relationship where someone is taking over another person, making them completely dependent, isolating them from family and friends. And a lot of people know somebody like that in their life who got taken over by a man or a woman, etc., a one-on-one thing. It could be a therapist who's unethical that makes you dependent and obedient. It could be a large group awareness training where you're going to get enlightened. It can be a multi-level marketing cult. It can be religious cults of all types. It can be political cults. And I do think of Putin as a cult leader of Russia, and I think of Xi as a cult leader of China. And again, I have these criteria, and I invite your listeners to check them out for themselves and see if they agree with my assessment. And if you think I'm off, let me know. And I'm always interested in evidence.
What I'm fascinated in is one thing you said there, which is that you had this accident and it created a break space whereby you were able to question the ideas. But what's fascinating for me is that, there's the you afterwards, where those ideas appear nonsensical. They maybe even appear disjointed and irrational. But the you inside the ideas, to you at that point, they would have seemed logically consistent, and they would have formed almost like an inclusive worldview, almost like a version of reality. How
it was a version of reality, exactly. Yeah, but what I do want to say, if I hope you don't mind me interrupting you, Jonathan, but what I want to say is that as a Mooney, I was not allowed to think negative thoughts about Moon, the doctrine, or the policies. I was literally programmed with phobias that demons would invade me, a la Exorcist movie. And so I was taught thought-stopping techniques, to chant, to pray, to get rid of the negative thoughts. I was sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night. So there wasn't a lot of logic happening as a Mooney. It was a lot of follow the leader blindly or else. And but there was a systematic worldview, and it basically boiled down to Moon's perfect. He's sinless. He's the Messiah. God is working through him. And if we just follow blindly our leaders in the pyramid structure, everything's going to work out and we will defeat Satan. And the power of Satan, I was literally told that World War III would happen in 1977. And cult leaders always like to make the apocalypse like imminent or in the next 3 years. And that's a way of motivating and keeping people willing to sacrifice so totally.
I was going to ask that question because I think it's, I was going to ask this later, but I think it's sort of apposite to ask it now. These ideas that, and this maybe is the commonality between political cults and religious ones, and that is the imprinting of ideas on the brain at a point where you're vulnerable, where you're perhaps scared and you're in fear, either of pure terror, as you say there, let's say the sort of millennial threat or something that's on the horizon, end of world kind of stuff. Or it could be a threat that your values, your identity are going to be destroyed or taken over by another group or whatever. But does it always require that sense of fear in order to imprint the cult's ideas onto a brain?
Good question. So I would answer your question this way, and this goes back to me learning about Chinese communist brainwashing, reading Robert J. Lifton's book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, that came out in 1961, based on his interviews with people coming out of Mao's China's programs, Edgar Schein's Coercive Persuasion, later Margaret Singer, who also worked with Chinese communist victims, wrote a book, Cults in Our Midst. But going back to Coercive Persuasion book of Edgar Schein, he used a model by social psychologist Kurt Lewin of unfreezing, changing, and refreezing. So the first step is to disorient a person's sense of self, sense of meaning in the world. And to the extent that the self is already out of balance, whether for me, my girlfriend dumped me and 3 attractive women flirted with me and love bombed me and got me in, that was my vulnerability. But people, death of a loved one, illness, graduating, losing a job, pandemic, other things can make people particularly more susceptible or vulnerable to a certainty voice of, we know the truth and come and be part of the solution. So it's the unfreezing, and then the indoctrination is the changing, and then the refreezing into the new identity. So that's how I want to explain it to your listeners, and I'll just emphasize what we now know in 2023, which when I started my training as a mental health professional in the mid-'80s, back then we didn't know that the brain was this plastic or malleable, or that there was neurogenesis, that we could actually build new wiring in our brains. I always knew that was the case experientially because it had happened to me, but now there's neuroscientific proof to demonstrate it, and that is also the key to how to help people exit. Is to get to the person who they were before, to ask them questions in a respectful, kind way. What did you think you were getting involved with? Go back in time. What were your, did you have any fears or worries about the recruitment? Oh yeah, I thought it was a cult. Aha, tell me more. What made you feel that way? And just getting people to realize, hey, the mind can get hacked. Intelligent, educated people can be hacked. And there are so many people I've met in 47 years who are brilliant and accomplished, but they got hacked. I should also add, a big portion of my population are born into authoritarian religious groups or cults, or like Russia. And I'll tell you a quick story since we're going to talk about Putin and Russia. I was invited when the Soviet Union fell to come to Moscow by a group of psychiatrists and psychologists because Western religious cults were flooding into the former Soviet Union. They wanted to know, what is a cult and what's it all about? So I'm teaching my BITE model and the influence continuum, and the audience, they were all mental health professionals, were like, Dr. Hassan, do you understand? You're describing the whole system. And this is literally how they sounded. I'm not making fun of their accent. Dr. Hassan, do you understand? You're describing the whole system of pedagogy of the Soviet Union? You understand we would put political dissidents into psychiatric facilities because they were questioning the regime? You know, these types of questions. And they're like, oh, you are counseling us. And I said, if the shoe fits, please, this is what I've learned. And, you know, and when you're raised in a totalist authoritarian political regime, unless you are exposed to people who weren't and have some type of way of reality testing, you think it's normal.
And this is going to be, I think, a controversial question for some of the listeners here, but does it help if a system like communism, which in itself is a belief system, you know, it's not necessarily a rational system, even though, you know, it came from books and marks and whatever, it is essentially a belief system, almost like a religious cult. Does it help that actually previously you had orthodoxy, that you had Russian orthodoxy, that you had quite a mystical mindset, and you had perhaps a foundation, dare I say it, of a certain sort of magical thinking? Is that a sort of richer environment? Because you've talked, I think, about America being very fertile ground for cults. It seems to me that Russia is also extremely fertile ground for this kind of mind hacking.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I want to say is, because this is my thing and I study psychology and I'm really fascinated at what is healthy and what's unhealthy, and modeling. Healthy parenting, if one is not raised in an authoritarian regime-like situation, the parents look at their child and they think of themselves as stewards, that their child is unique and their job is to help them to grow up to be themselves, to reach their fulfillment and what's called individuate and go on and not. But the unhealthy parenting wants to use corporal punishment and drill obedience and dependency and keep the child always a child in relationship to the parent and doesn't want any deviation. So if someone is raised in that system by a family and in a society, even if they come to the US or they go to Israel, for example, unless they have experiences of what is healthy psychology and have some perspective on what happened to them, there's a very strong inclination to find another authoritarian leader or all or nothing, black or white, good versus evil, us versus them ideology to follow, because it's familiar, right? So I'm afraid that many Russian Jews who went to Israel, and many of them are still listening to propaganda from Putin, RT, TV, etc., they're going to follow Netanyahu's authoritarian pitches, being afraid of Arabs, and we need to do violence, and we need to expand settlements and with the extreme religious right. And because that's what's familiar for them.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one as well, because there's another aspect of this, isn't there? And that is denying agency to people. It's taking away responsibility for decisions and saying, don't worry about that. You know, we can handle this for you. You don't have to take responsibility for your actions or others. We'll give you a rule book to follow. And that is very much the Putin model. It was, give me power over politics. Don't worry yourselves about it. And you will get, you know, the minimum standard of living. We will, you know, you will live a certain level of comfort, and we will handle the responsibility. Now, this seems to be a sort of authoritarian paternalism, which Ukrainians instinctively resist and fight. I wouldn't even say it's sort of, you know, yes, there are political inheritances there as well, but that there's also a sort of cultural aversion to that kind of denial of agency. So is this a key difference in the way both authoritarian regimes and cults work? Or a similarity, rather, I mean.
Well, I think so. Again, if one understands the influence continuum, and here's the model of destructive mind control, here's the model of healthy influence, then it becomes really easy to detect whether or not there's an internal locus of control that's being encouraged or an external locus of control to some political leader or whoever. And you raise an interesting point, which I think bears amplification, which is that mind control cults, whether they're political or religious, they want to keep people children, and they want people to look to the leader as a father figure or a mother figure. So there's a regression, developmental regression to childhood, where we want to have daddy or mommy make sure to keep us safe. And they say, trust me, I got this, which isn't rational, isn't logical, and can be quite dangerous and destructive.
But it does create certainties, or it creates the sense of certainty.
So what I want to say about that is, and the E of the BITE model is about emotional control techniques, which I would add awe is a positive emotional state that is elicited by charismatic figures who do stage, production things for messaging, etc. A very important component to look at in terms of cult leader profiles or predatory profiles is what Erich Fromm called in the 1940s malignant narcissism. And narcissism has a certain number of traits: the grandiosity, the self-entitled, everything's transactional, but there's a lack of empathy. It's all about them and not about their followers and tuning into their followers. What Fromm did was add the malignant pieces, thinking you're above the law, so the ends justify the means, kill anybody, bomb anything, doesn't matter, it's fine. Pathological lying with no hesitation at all. The threats, the paranoia, the sadism, the harassment. So you can, again, on freedomofmind.com, there's a whole laundry list of that. And so the key is when people are unbalanced and they're fearful, let's talk about COVID and the pandemic and economic, the amygdala, the fear part of us which survival is dependent upon to keep us safe from real danger, when that gets activated, and it can be through messaging, our frontal cortex goes offline. In other words, our critical thinking goes offline. And so then it's easier to implant ideas that are nonsensical, that don't make sense at all, like Zelensky is a Nazi. When the Russians watched him as an actor and loved him and thought he was a great guy, now they have to do mind pretzel bends to think of him as a Nazi, and he's got a Jewish history, right? It does not make any logical sense, but the certainty of it and the behavior, information, thought, and emotional control bubble of information control that most Russian people are existing under, there's no room to say, no, I don't think so. Or if they do, they're afraid to tell anyone because they may be reported, and then they might get arrested and sent to jail or Siberia. So what I want to say is that we're human beings, we're more remarkably adaptive to environments, and what we're experiencing today has never existed before the early 2000s in terms of this digital world that we're all spending hours and hours and hours on. And with AI in the background and data collection on us, we're unaware of just how much our brains are being shaped unconsciously, unless we learn these tools to, wait a minute, let me unplug, and in fact, I did a TEDx talk, how can I know if I've been brainwashed? And step one is to unplug from whatever rituals you're doing. If you're online, like turn off your phone, turn off your computer, sleep, eat, exercise, listen to music, go dancing, play with your dogs, have sex, do normal, healthy things, and interact with real people who you've known your whole life. If you still have, friends and family, re-anchor yourself. And then step 2 of the reality testing strategy I did in my TEDx talk is learn about authoritarian brainwashing. Chinese communist brainwashing is a very good model. Eight criteria of Lifton that you can look up. I've interviewed Lifton on my website. You can listen to those interviews. Use my BITE model of authoritarian control. But then the next step is to deliberately seek out critics and former members. And this is part of mind control, is bad cults don't want you to talk to critics and former members. They want you to just badmouth them. They're evil, they're satanic. But if one takes a position, I'm smart and I can evaluate the truth or falsity of any claims or look for evidence for myself, listen with an open mind of why they're critical, why they exited. And then the next step is to go back in time, knowing what you've learned now with these BITE model and what former members and critics have to say. Go back in time. In the case of Trump, for example, what's your first memory of Trump? Was it positive or negative? Was it because you saw him on the Apprentice TV show or what? But go back in time, knowing about brainwashing and mind control, listening and including what you've now learned from having experienced Trump as a former president. And ask yourself, if I knew then what I know now, would I have ever gotten involved? And if the answer is no, well, then it's time to exit. And what I want to say to anyone who's listening to this, there's no shame in saying, you know what, I believed what I believed at the time based on the information and experiences I had at the time, but now I know more. It's time to move on. I want to have a future where I'm not mind controlled by anybody or any group.
And it's a hallmark of cult leaders that they foment this impression of being infallible, that they cannot be questioned, their actions cannot be queried or deconstructed in the way that you might, be relatively cynical about, people who you consider your opponents, for instance.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, it's easy for people to have confirmation bias. It's a social psychology term where you are looking only for information that conforms with your existing worldview, as opposed to what I'm encouraging is be open-minded. To periodically, check in with other points of view, because maybe it's time to update your own belief system. The thing is, be dynamic and be open to learning new things. And essentially, the truth will stand up to scrutiny. And if somebody is saying, trust me, I never make a mistake, I know more than every general, I know more than every economist, it's like, huh? He hasn't studied economics at all and he knows more. How is that possible? And then you listen into details and there are no details showing that he knows anything about economics or military things, right?
And I'd like to turn to the sort of techniques of imprinting, because I think it's interesting if people can try and examine whether they have been imprinted, whether they've been subject to these techniques. And this is where you have, I say, religious techniques bear an uncanny similarity to propaganda techniques, and that is to create mantras. Now, whether that is talking points or narratives, or whether it's sort of religious narratives, like, saying the same sort of prayers and routines every time, you go to church or so on, there is a certain element of repetition to these narratives. And the perception of truth is then created through that sort of repetition.
Well, yeah. So I try to encourage people not to get into automatic behaviors like reciting prayers mindlessly just because you have your whole life, but actually think about what was the intention of this prayer. And usually, I'm Jewish, usually prayers are about gratefulness. You know, I'm glad to be alive. Thank you for letting me have a body that works mostly. Don't do to others what you don't want done to you. There are these narratives and stories that can be very powerful in a constructive way. And the Bible has lots of bad stories that can be taken out of context and used to justify genocide and homophobia and all kinds of other terrible things. But I guess what I want to say, if I may, is that when I was researching the Cult of Trump book, one of the things I didn't realize was how many authoritarian cults comprised the cult of Trump, and how many of those were actually religious cults, like the Moonies, the group I was in, Scientology, Falun Gong, which is a Chinese cult. They do Epoch Times. The biggest cult in the United States and the world is a network of churches that they call themselves, I should say, New Apostolic Reformation churches and mega churches. And what makes them different than typical Pentecostals or typical Protestants is they have a person, male or female, that says, I am a prophet and I speak to God. God gives me revelations, or I'm an apostle. And they speak in tongues, cast out demons, do faith healings, but they operate behavior control, information, thought, and emotional control. And they indoctrinate their followers to be so afraid of Satan. And of course, the Democrats are Satan, and all the pedophiles and drinking children's bloods and other irrational things. And so the whole idea is about this black and white, us versus them, good versus evil framing. And the only way to do God's will is to follow the prophet blindly. Otherwise, Satan will invade you, and then you'll have to have demons cast out of you. Of course, the demons are often, people are like, I want to leave this place. It's awful. I feel suffocated. But that programming kicks in. And in fact, in my book, Freedom of Mind, the dark blue one over my shoulder, I have a chapter on how to undo phobia programming, because that's one of the major mind control techniques of authoritarian cults, religious or political cults. What I also want to say, in addition to the NAR cult, is that there's a schism that's taken place there, because some of the prophets are sticking with God told me Trump won the 2020 election. And some are saying, we have to rethink this one because, in fact, the overwhelming evidence is he lost. Right? So there's a schism happening there, which is very interesting, but also important to be aware of. And that people are coming out of these groups in droves, but unless they understand brainwashing and mind control, many of them are turning their back on religion entirely because they got so burned. They were so traumatized from being in the group. And one, going back to the influence continuum, if you're in a healthy group and you want to leave it, the typical reaction is, sorry that you have to go, stay in touch. You're a good person. Come visit sometime. The authoritarian cults immediately cast you as the enemy, and they attack you and call you names, etc. And so, what I'm trying to say is there's this conditional love being in the group. Yes, you're a comrade as long as you walk in lockstep and believe what we believe and do exactly what you're told. The minute you start questioning, you're rejected. And that's not healthy.
And this is what we see in Russia. I mean, this phrase, enemy of the people, dare I say it, we also saw a similar slogan where the media were branded as the sort of the enemy, fake news and so on. But we're
Right.
seeing this very much so on a societal wide scale in Russia, where anyone is branded as a foreign agent, if they're any voice that even questions the regime at all.
Right.
Even more so, they could be branded a terrorist organization, like, say, Navalny's organization or any political unit outside of government control. People have had to flee the country. There is now potentially the threat that, as in the 1970s, they may be pursued by GRU or SVR kind of agents abroad. And that whole sort of terror and confusion amongst the diaspora, which we know the Bolsheviks used very effectively in the 1920s to destroy the white forces. All these are kind of rearing their heads again. And as you say, it's this othering of people. And what I find remarkable, and I love to understand the mechanics of this, it's not that people are simply sort of brainwashed and they disbelieve their neighbors or they disbelieve somebody on the television or the internet. They will disbelieve their own children. I've spoken to many Ukrainians who phone up, relatives, cousins, even parents who are in Russia, inside of the propagandistic bubble, and they will not believe their own relatives who they may have spent many, many years with, that say they're being hit by missiles or, certain things are happening.
Yeah, and we need to remember what happened with Adolf Hitler and the Nazi youth who would turn in their own parents if their parents expressed the question about whether the Fuhrer was the great man that they believed. And same with Mao's China. And currently in the Xi regime, they're using agents around the world to threaten people if they're speaking out against China, that their relatives who are still inside of China are going to be punished. So it's fear control, it's behavior control, it's thought control. And honestly, I think of all the world issues, including global climate crisis, but I think undue influence is the number one issue, especially now with the digital world and AI. And the only solution is in telling everybody, hey, it's your mind, you should control it. You need to be able to understand that these social media platforms are made to addict you, to stay on it, because they'll make more ad revenue. And you need to exercise the pause button or the stop button or get up and walk and not get into doom scrolling where you wake up and it's hours later and you have this overload of information that's been put in your head, but you haven't thought about it and chewed it over and tested whether it's real or not.
And there's an interesting propaganda technique. Now, there's a difference perhaps here between the religious programming or the cult religious programming and political programming, because for most of Putin's reign, the object of propaganda was not to incite action. It wasn't like Soviet propaganda and like, we've got the answer to everything, you got to believe that rather than something else. Putin's programming is far more subtle than that, in that it's like, believe in the warm, fuzzy nationalist idea, but don't worry, you don't have to do anything about it. You just have to kind of believe it. What we want you to do, mostly, is to be apathetic, indifferent. And if you are going to think about stuff, well, we're going to give you 100 different conflicting ideas to actually force you to not believe in the idea of truth at all. If we can't convince you of this thing, then we're going to destroy the foundations of any truth. So you're just sort of floundering in nothing. With the advent of the war, they've had to flip it because they're now trying to persuade people to take an active interest, to fight and die for the country. And they're finding that many don't want to do that.
Right, exactly. And I read Peter Pomerantsev book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, if I'm remembering his book. But he talked about how media is so stage managed to create the illusion that there's freedom, with deliberate, protests and this and that to create that illusion, but everything is stage managed. So I represent that. And I also want to just mention, Putin has used the Russian Orthodox Church in terms of using the religious affiliations and impulses. And it was Putin and the Russian Orthodox Church that linked with the American right-wing ultra-extremist Christian nationalists. So they were actually brought over to have conferences in Russia. So there's a direct link there, as well as to the NRA, I should add.
Mm. And looking at the sort of the cult behaviors of some of the organizations you've mentioned there in the US, is there a profound difference because they want their followers to take some kind of action? Whether it be sort of contributing money or sort of building churches or doing something, they're not necessarily trying to foster inaction. So is there a different sort of dynamic going on there?
So in my research for the cult of Trump, I learned about a very important concept I want to share with your listeners called fourth generation warfare. So it was written up formally by an American military strategist, William Lind, L-I-N-D, in the 1980s. And he basically talked about psychological warfare aimed at creating uncertainty, distrust in experts, distrust in science, distrust in institutions, but also creating narratives where they can influence both sides of any subject and polarize the population to distrust others as a prelude to taking over.
That's very familiar, isn't it? That sounds familiar.
Right. And we know William Lind met with Donald Trump. We know that William Lind connected with Paul Weyrich, one of the most important figures in the Christian right-wing nationalist, movement. I've done numerous interviews with James Scaminacci, former naval intelligence expert who got his political sociology degree from Stanford, wrote up fourth generation warfare. It's very important to understand that there's deliberate infiltration on the left and the right towards polarization against the other. And yes, they're trying to distract people, make them, spend their lives on video gaming and not care about voting, or binge watching movies and not caring or feeling like it's hopeless, etc. And so I really believe everyone needs to get educated. Hey, we're in a psychological warfare and information warfare situation globally. And authoritarians don't want the public to understand what is being done to them. And I'm trying to get the message out any way that I can. Hey, our freedom is on the line here. And the answer to the right-wing extremists isn't left-wing extremism. It's stepping back and going, wait a minute, let's go back to core values. Like, don't do to others what you don't want done to you. And humans have succeeded as a species due to cooperation and collaboration, not because they're selfish and greedy, Ayn Rand, the cult of objectivism, that self-interest was good and altruism was evil. And we want to get people to step back and start thinking about the future. And I'll just rant one more minute and say, we don't live in a post-truth world. That's an ideology that says it doesn't matter what's true. What's true still matters. You walk off a 10-story building, gravity's going to make you fall and you're going to die or be crippled for life. It's not a hallucination. It's a fact. And we want to go back to facts and evidence. And as we're approaching proliferation of deep fakes, videos and audios, etc., everyone's going to need to be ultra careful who they're choosing as trustworthy sources. And reality test them by not just blindly believing anything, but checking out what are other points of view on things. And be careful of anything that's overly simplistic, because the world is complex. And you can look at one phenomenon, have a kernel of truth in it, and you need to step back to see the bigger picture to have a more correct evaluation of what's going on.
And in the age of, as I say, deepfakes and so on, this is going to become more of a challenge, isn't it? And I think if you look at Russian propaganda, it's sophisticated in the sort of narratives that it throws out. It's not that sophisticated in the use of platforms and in the use of technology. I mean, very good use of TV and so on that plays very well with the older generation, but doesn't play so well if you're under 40. The Chinese, however, seem to be far more sophisticated in their use of digital media. We have the social credit system. We have the advent of AI being able to create truly sort of personalized materials at scale. Do you fear that perhaps the future is authoritarian simply because the tools becoming available are going to overwhelm the capacity of democracies to fight this sort of weaponized information?
So the big problem with open societies, or relatively open societies, democratic societies, is we don't want to censor. We want to allow dissonant points of view and such. And in the United States, because of the Supreme Court decision to allow dark money to be given to politicians, we have foreign governments buying our politicians to change policies that will make it easier for them to control us. So we don't have data privacy laws here. We don't have regulations against the social tech platforms. China does, to try to protect their people, and Russia does. So the asymmetry of that is very important to note. And we need to have regulations that is internationally recognized by anyone who cares about human rights and freedom to choose. And I would also add that nobody wants to be mind controlled. My experience with people born and raised in countries, when they're exposed to people who haven't been, like, it's a breath of fresh air. Really? You can read whatever you want? You're not afraid of somebody reporting you? Really? Once you have a taste of that, it's very hard to pretend you never had that experience. And this is where Chinese students who came to the US, Russian students had experience here. It's very hard for them to pretend that life is better there in an authoritarian regime. That said, all of this, what seems to me to be deliberate lone actor terrorism, where people online are being encouraged to go shoot up churches and random groups of people, I believe Xi and Putin and other enemies of the US want to use those stories to tell their people, see, America isn't so great. They're letting people kill their own children with assault rifles. In Russia, you can't own an assault rifle unless you're in the military. You'll be arrested, right? But the lobbying of the NRA to say, oh, the Second Amendment, people should have, 20 million AR-15s. 20 million AR-15s for what? Well, civil war. We want Americans to kill each other.
Absolutely.
Let's ramp them up.
Absolutely. I think that weaponization of the narrative is clear. And they use a similar technique when they look at Ukraine. They say, well, look, it's corrupt. Why are you defending this country? Why are you even bothering to prevent a genocide there? They're corrupt to the core, irrespective of the fact that actually in Transparency International's reports, Russia is quite a few percentage points below Ukraine in terms of corruption. In the last part of the conversation, I really wanted to turn to deprogramming, because I think it's incredibly important, this idea of deprogramming individuals. But what on earth do you do when you've got a society of tens of millions of people living in a toxic information bubble. These people still believe that they're rational. These people believe that the information they're getting is truthful or partially truthful. They also believe that they are good, moral people making decisions that are positive, even though from our perspective, that is not the case. How on earth do you tackle that problem at a scale of, say, Russia?
I need a lot more resources. No, but seriously, what I want to tell your listeners is what doesn't work to help someone who's in a bubble, who's been indoctrinated. What doesn't work is attacking the leader, the doctrine, or the policies of the cult itself. So, because that activates the cult identity to be defensive, to feel like you're persecuting them. That's the opposite of what works. What works is a respectful, curious, active listening approach, and asking them questions about other groups that they would agree are mind control cults, like Chinese communist brainwashing programs, or traffickers of sex traffickers, labor traffickers, pimps. Those are the two that work the best. And so then talking about those and then describing the bite model of authoritarian control, which I have blogs on this topic and interviews with experts in both fields, that gets behind the programming. But the idea that I want to convey is people need to exit themselves. It's not a you persuade them out of it. That doesn't work. The other thing that I believe we can do at scale is empower people who've already been in cults, like myself, and there are millions of them in the United States and around the world, and in Russia, and in China, and empower them to tell their stories and how they were deceptively recruited and how they were indoctrinated into this new pseudo identity that was dependent and obedient, and that there's life after group. Because the average person, when they think about people in cults, is they must be stupid or they must be uneducated, right? And people who are in the bubble don't think of themselves that way at all. I was an extra honors student. That wasn't going to work with me. But when my deprogrammer said, we'd like to share Chinese communist brainwashing techniques with you, I was all in, because I was programmed against communism as Satan. So I was all in to listen to this. And then I started thinking about every criteria. And I was like, wait a minute, they're Satan, we're God, but we do the same things. And that started the crack in the door of me going, this does not compute. Mm-hmm. But I was also being exposed to ex-members who are happy and fulfilled being out of the group. So that was that context. And I should also add, it was a voluntary intervention. And it wasn't because I wanted to leave or I had any conscious doubts. It's I wanted to prove to my family that I wasn't in a cult and I wasn't brainwashed. So again, it's a matter of messaging and creating a way to get access. Now, I don't know if this is true, but I've been told that some Russians can use a VPN to bypass the firewalls and get access to other information, in which case then we need to get to those channels, put up channels perhaps like your own that people can listen to and start to cogitate and think about. I should also say my books have been translated and published in Russian. I don't know how easy it will be for people to find it, but I know that those exist. I have them on my bookshelf in print form. I'm sure somebody's pirated it and scanned it, etc., which is fine with me for the purpose of helping folks as much as possible. But the problem so far that I've encountered, for example, with the cult of Trump, is that American corporate media doesn't want to promote my work. So when I get told, oh, you are, in a cult, Steve, and you're being censored because the corporate media doesn't, I think there's truth to that. And if you're wealthy and you have power, you don't necessarily want people to question whether or not your oil investments and fossil fuel investments is a good thing when you know that it's a bad thing for the planet. So there's information control that's being done too. Fortunately, there are other avenues for people to get information that's trustworthy.
So it's not necessarily that they don't like you questioning a particular cult ideology. What they don't like is you teaching people the techniques to question everything, because that's going to
Right.
undermine their business models as well.
Right. And I'll say categorically, I was actually interviewed for a business book called The Culting of Brands, maybe 20 years ago. And the fellow said, my editor wants me to interview you. I'm like, why? Well, we're fascinated with how cults create such fervent, dedicated followers, and we want people to love, Apple that way, and we want people to love other brands that way. So this knowledge has been incorporated in the corporate world and by some political strategists. But again, for me, the only hope to have a future where there's freedom on the planet is to teach everybody and to realize that we need to realize we're on one planet together, and just ramping up nationalism to hate other countries is not going to help. And in fact, with the AIs, the latest is the worry that AIs are going to find humans irrelevant and even dangerous to their existence. And that's why there's so many people, including myself, that have signed the letter of concern that we need to establish international regulations for the use of AI, as there were things put in place with nuclear bombs and nuclear power.
I think that's a great place to end on, the idea of regulation, the idea of consensus, and getting back to things we can agree on rather than these weaponized divisions, which foster a lot of this cult-like sort of thinking, and clearly someone benefits from that. Stephen, thank you so much for your time. I know your time is incredibly precious. It's been a real privilege speaking to you about these topics. And yeah, I really encourage people to check out your books and, of course, your TEDx.
Yeah, and check out, I have a course for those who want a deeper dive. It's over 9 hours. I call it a foundational course for clinicians. They can actually get continuing ed credit if you are a clinician, but everybody is taking it now, particularly ex-members, and finding the material incredibly valuable and useful in their healing.
That's so fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.